one and all, and welcome to yet another installment of Cookie Pocket. I'm joined by my friends Mitchell and Zach, as always, and today we're discussing something that is a bit of a historical lark for me. We're discussing Disney's Pinocchio. To be clear, the 1940 Pinocchio, not the more recent live-action Pinocchio starring Tom Hanks, which just about nobody received positively. But the 1940 classic. The credits name Ben Sharpstein and Hamilton Lusk as the supervising directors, but if you look at the production history and sort of the chain of command at Disney at the time, I think it's fairly accurate to say that Walt Disney was the director of this film the way we understand the role of the director today in film. He is credited as producer, which is, I guess, also fitting. But this Pinocchio is one of many stories that Walt bought the rights to with the intent of adapting it into a feature film. And Pinocchio's place in history is particularly interesting to me because it's Disney Animation's second feature film, released 3 years after Snow White, which was a huge success for them. But at that point, animated cinema was not really proven. I guess you could say that Snow White was a step in the right direction, but there were still plenty of valid concerns at the time that it was more of a fad and not a medium that could portray mature stories with depth. So in that way, I think Pinocchio is very interesting to discuss. But with that intro out of the way, what did you two make of Pinocchio? And had either of you seen this before? Because I'm not sure.
I remember seeing this when I was very young, but I hadn't seen it since I was maybe 4 or 5. Certainly not in a way that I was paying attention to it. I think my elementary school, like a lot of elementary schools, if it was like raining during recess, they might play a movie during lunch sometimes. And sometimes Pinocchio is that movie. So, you know, maybe I saw like 20 minutes of this while I was eating ramen noodles out of a thermos when I was in 5th grade. But I haven't sat down and watched it as a proper movie since the clamshell VHS at my grandparents' when I was very, very young. And it was interesting to approach it now from a totally different perspective, because at that age, of course, I didn't know, I didn't know how old it was. I didn't really understand most of it. Like I knew that Pinocchio's father got stuck in a whale and he went to an amusement park, but a lot of the details really didn't stick with me. And so I was, I think, suitably surprised by some of this, and I did find some of it quite funny. It's something that I thought was very amusing. I remembered Pleasure Island as just sort of basically being like Atlantic City. Like they go to this big place full of amusement parks and casinos and rides. And I kind of thought that just the things that they did there and the way they lollygagged and wasted time, my memory was that was kind of the selfish, sinful things that they did. But in this movie, Pleasure Island is kind of just like a place where kids can go to be utter gremlins and just like break things and get into fights and get drunk and smoke.
So Atlantic City.
The amusement park element really isn't central, and I found that quite funny. I do think, Christian, you mentioned that this is kind of a step towards the medium telling more complex emotional stories. I don't know if I'd quite go that far. This is a little more complicated than Snow White, but it is still fundamentally like a children's fable.
Sure.
The thing that really impressed me about this was just technically all the innovations that have happened since like 3 years previously when Disney made Snow White. And this was only the third animated feature ever to be made by an American studio, because there's a Gulliver's Travels Fleischer adaptation in between those that nobody really remembers anymore, but that's the second ever animated feature. And even just in those 3 years, the animation underwater, the animation of like the vehicles in this and the animals and the moving objects, they're things that I think are easy to look back on now as being like, oh, quaint and traditional and simplistic Disney. But when you read about the effort they went through to like animate these in a way that would make sense and look pleasing to the eye within the world, it is really impressive, kind of the advances they made within the medium within a comparatively pretty brief period of time. I gave it a 4 out of 5. I don't necessarily think watching it I was 4 out of 5 entertained, but just for appreciation, I think it has to get that great rating from me.
Mm-hmm. The craziest rating back in my day, the craziest rating I think that could be applied to this movie is the big old G, right? Because there's a lot of very sus things happening here, gentlemen. There's a lot of violence and theft and assault and battery and vandalism and child grooming and child trafficking and child slavery.
Yeah.
Yes.
And smoking and pool. it's so drinking underage. Mm-hmm. It's okay though, he's wooden. The law does not apply to him, right, Christian? Right, okay.
You can make that
no
argument.
rules.
Yes.
Says the puppet can't drink beer.
Yes, exactly. Now I do think there's a certain timelessness with those themes, and I think they were definitely not considering their impact later on, because I do think what really sticks this in its time period is just kind of throwing your kid outside and telling them not to do bad things, and this hoping they make it to school and back is kind of like the classic 40s child rearing procedure.
That is a good point.
And I do think I also think that portraying his quote unquote dad as like this perfectly kind soul that does nothing wrong, as him neglecting to actually instill value in his life, is kind of a pretty significant message to have in a kid's film. Mm-hmm. And not even just to mention like how depraved everything is, especially in our looking at it retrospectively. I also think having those Disney like fantasy themes more as like a guiding force rather than being absolutely integral to the story is very difficult to imagine now. And I think it was something that was pretty intricately done. I think there's a lot of very subtle implementation of fantasy here that you don't really see, especially with later Disney productions within the next like 20 years or so. Like they're not, everything really is focusing on the fantasy while also having an underlying moral theme, or like kind of you were saying, Zach, it's like a fable essentially. This is kind of like the opposite. It's kind of just having this big grounded story, and the what's more grand than the fantasy is like the settings and everything, and like the interactions and the talking. Like I was really surprised that there really wasn't a whole lot of singing going on, and there wasn't really a lot of joyousness. And I think the when you wish upon a star sandwich kind of really exemplifies that, because you're like, wait, this was a Disney movie, like this is supposed to be like the happy kind of ending sort of thing, and it just kind of felt a little weird because it didn't, the villains are still around, like the world sucks, right? It's not just like a gray world that has good and evil in it. It's like the world straight up just sucks, which I know Zach freaking loves when the world just sucks.
Yeah, boy.
So I just think there's a lot of uniqueness in this, very surprising, very grounded, and I think just having those different locales and everything is just like, there's so much that just shoves like everything in the animation department. Like it's showing off, not like, oh, showing off like, look what we can do. It's like showing off like, this is what hard work looks like, kind of showing off like well-deserved, like 10 out of 10 freaking animation work. And the restoration definitely lends a lot to that as well. But I tried looking up YouTube videos to see like old, like what the original print or something close to original prints or like early restorations look like, and it still looks freaking insane. I mean, especially when the fairy comes, like that's like better than video games in the 2010s. Like that looks so realistic. So there's just a lot to write home about. It's very, very surprising, and I think it's a simple story. It is a fable, but I also think those kind of like minute moments, those little like bits of dialogue that are very telling, and like parents would be like, oh yeah, that's great. And even if a kid is just not paying attention and doesn't know what's going on, you still get the message. You get the same message. And I think that's what's really special about it. So I gave it a 4.5.
I think a lot of the discussing kind of aspects of the movie that are maybe a little darker than Disney would go today. I think there's two things that contribute to that. The one is Disney at this point, it's only their second movie, so they haven't, and they're also a pretty small company at this point still. I mean, they're still being distributed by RKO. They don't even have their own distribution wing yet. So they haven't really developed like a brand identity. And also, I think that does just speak to how old this movie is, where when I was watching this, I looked up, because Pinocchio as a story nowadays feels like a story that's been around forever. It feels like Cinderella or something, where it's just a folk story that's been around forever. Nobody really knows exactly where it came from. Maybe there's like a specific translation everybody points to. But Pinocchio is very specifically based on a book from 1887. So that's less than 60 years before this movie was made. And a lot of the animators who worked on this movie, it's quite possible they would have had that book read to them when they were kids. And I think what I'm just getting at is, I think this movie and the book that it's based on, which is much more bitter than the movie, but it sort of just speaks to a darker time in children's entertainment, where children's entertainment could afford to be meaner because the world was meaner. I think when the people who made this movie were growing up, the world was a crueler place, because that would have been like the early 1900s. Even within just the 30 years of like 1910 to 1940, there's a ton of advancements that happen in Western civilization, in medicine and the home and technology, that make childhood a lot easier. And I think looking at this and just drawing a line to how a movie like this would be made today, I mean, we saw a couple of years ago with the 2022 version and how different that was. You just see the ways that culture and the world and the way that we raise children has changed so drastically. That was kind of a rambling big speech, but I think I got at my core idea.
Yeah, no, definitely worth sharing. I came at this was kind of shortlisted for Cookie Pocket for a while. I'm not sure why. I wanted to look at a more classic Disney movie, and I know Mitchell had put us into sort of the Disney Renaissance with Beauty and the Beast and Lion King, and those were fun episodes. So I thought it would be interesting to take a big step back. And I had seen Pinocchio, but it's been a really long time. What made me decide to do this season was reading a book about the making of Pinocchio. And this film was in development a really long time, and there's a lot of interesting facts, and Zach already alluded to so many technical advancements. I don't have the book in front of me, but I know that something to do with the cell shading was largely improved from Snow White, and it's hard not to talk about this without talking about Snow White as a reference point, but the prince and Snow White herself often look kind of, I don't know, like almost too fluid in their movements, and like they don't have defined borders, and that's not really a problem here anymore. And another advancement technically had something to do with transferring the drawings onto film. That was somehow a smoother process. Reading about the development period for this is fascinating, because they were working on this film for months, and they had a plot outline and character designs for Pinocchio and others. And Walt kind of looked at it and was like, this isn't working. Let's start over. And it's unfathomable to me that any, let alone Disney, obviously would never do that now. But I think any studio wouldn't even consider doing that, because you're months into it, and any sort of massive delay like that is pushing back the payoff.
Yeah.
And
on your second movie too.
Yeah, and they needed this to be a success. I mean, Snow White was huge for them. It built the animation studio, but they were not established or given success like a handout like it is now. So I just think that's fascinating. I landed on a 4.5, like Mitchell. I think that the intensity and like meanness, as Zach described, really gets to me. Like the scenes with the kids that are irreversibly turned into donkeys and sent to either the circus or the salt mine. I don't know about you guys, but I would pick the circus there.
And maybe if it wasn't called Pleasure Island, I wouldn't want to go there.
Another thing is just all the characters. I love talking about characters. This was a big thing in season 1 for me, especially when I didn't have a good handle on asking more complex questions. I would always be like, who's your favorite character? And I'm going back to that because in 88 minutes, you get basically, I think, 8 or so well-defined characters where their purpose and their individuality is communicated in a very concise manner. But I wanted to ask you both, maybe not favorites, but how did you feel the villains were incorporated, and Geppetto and Lampwick and the animals and our whole cast?
I really like Honest John. I think Honest John is a great character.
Yes.
The cat, that's kind of his sidekick, his buddy that goes around with him. I read that Mel Blanc of the Looney Tunes recorded an entire character for that was just left on the cutting room floor, which I think is such a shame. There's a very Mel Blanc moment at the beginning of this where all the clocks are going off and everyone's snoring in Geppetto's house, and Jiminy says, "Be quiet," which in a very Mel Blanc way. There's that like Mel Blanc scream that like peaks the mic and you could hear the room around him. and then I thought about that before I even knew about the Mel Blanc thing. But I'd love to hear that, even though I think it does work that one is mute and one does the talking. It wasn't really a like thing, but the character of Geppetto, I didn't come away from this movie either being very interested in or liking very much, which did kind of surprise me because it is kind of a meme in regard to Pinocchio that people are like, oh, why is he building a little boy? That's kind of creepy. And sure, that's a meme, and people point that out with other versions. But watching this film, I was struck with the feeling that Geppetto is kind of creepy. Like the first thing he does when he builds Pinocchio is he uses him to kick his cat, and he's weirdly affectionate with his fish, and there were just all kinds of things that I had forgotten about the character that maybe they hit me in the wrong way, but I did not come away from the movie really liking Geppetto that much or feeling this affection for him as a fatherly figure, and I was way more interested in just Pinocchio's progress through life outside, which I have never read the original Pinocchio book, but I understand the book is way more about that. It's just about Pinocchio's journeys outside of the household on his way to school. He gets sent to jail. He's witness to a child being beaten to death. Like these wild things that happen to him. And I might have liked to see more of that than returning to this whole thing of Geppetto being stuck in the whale. I didn't find that maybe interesting enough to hold down the conclusion of the movie.
So you're saying Pinocchio has to like kill somebody, or
no? I'm not saying Pinocchio has to kill somebody, but
like drunk driving or something. He's like almost on the verge.
I think when I read about the things that happen in the Pinocchio book, I think of The Wind in the Willows, which is a book that I liked a lot when I was a kid. It was adapted by Disney as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, I think, or the story of Mr. Toad or something like that. And that's just these characters kind of ambling about in the countryside and getting into strange situations. And I think I would have, and we get some of that. We get him at Pleasure Island, him on the way to school. He meets Honest John. He meets people who try to swindle him. I might have liked to see just a little bit more of that because I preferred that stuff in the movie.
I'm glad you're getting into these story differences because both of the things that you're kind of taking issue with here were driven by Walt. And I'm getting this from the book, but in early stages of production, some of the animators were pushing for this scene with Geppetto where he like observes children returning home from school and is super weepy about it because he doesn't have a child. And Walt was kind of like, guys, that's creepy. It doesn't need to be that weird or intense. He's just a nice, normal man who thinks it would be nice to have a son. And so with that in mind, I think, especially for the time period, like we've talked about how this is entrenched in the morals of like late 30s, I don't think Geppetto comes across as creepy. And I think even like the stuff where he's like teasing Figaro and the fish, I think that's all very cutesy and playful. And another big Walt change is making Pinocchio much more innocent, because one of the biggest challenges the production faced was that they found Pinocchio to be a very unlikable character. And it's true in the original story, he's kind of this snarky, hard-edged, rather than being this big-eyed, innocent person that doesn't understand morals. He is just kind of willfully disobedient. So it's interesting to weigh those changes, I guess.
I think what makes the, not knowing the full contrast, obviously, but what makes this more engaging and relatable to the average American, I guess I would say, is he literally lives the life of a kid that's running away, and he's kind of just having run-ins with people as he's kind of making a decision to go along with whatever, which is pretty much what you'd expect what would happen with a kid, like an average kid. Like an average kid wouldn't just be a freaking dick and just like crap on everybody and just be mean and like you're not born mean. Like you're kind of coming from the perspective that even he was born from a nice guy. He was raised in a nice environment for like 2 seconds, but he was neglected, and he wasn't really parented. He was kind of just like talked to his face. And I feel like the two things that supplement that, this will answer, go back way back when Christian asked the question about who our favorite characters were, quote unquote. What is Lamplight? Is that his name? What's his name? Lampwick.
Oh, yeah.
Lampwick. I think Lampwick is a great embodiment of like trying to be friends with everybody and just following whatever he's doing. And it's super relatable because Pinocchio doesn't come across as like an ignorant, dumb kid. He kind of comes across as just a naive, like somebody who's just been born type kid, like somebody who's just assuming the best and just doing whatever seems to be the most engaging at the time. Like literally just like a normal kid thing. And he just kind of gets into these crazy adult things very easily. And that's something that you would expect of the time period and something that you would expect now, just in using different metaphors. And I'll also say that Jiminy Cricket, which I'm surprised we haven't mentioned him yet, is a great kind of red herring, or like an irony that the fairy puts in as kind of like, the point is that it's been in you the whole time, kind of cliche, and that he didn't need someone else to be his conscience, that no one else can be your guiding force. You have to be the one that decides for yourself how your life goes. And that's a super powerful sentiment. And I think that Jiminy Cricket does a great job at like progressing in his own way and kind of constantly trying to like force his own values on him, and kind of being like a bad step parent, I guess. And just kind of following him on his journey and keep trying because he cares a lot, but knowing that he's not really parenting him. He's not telling him why. He's not giving him a reason. He's just telling him he's doing everything wrong, and seeing how that fails, which is crazy. It's like a crazy subtext in like, Pinocchio just smoking and playing pool. So it's kind of, and amongst like a fairy just coming out of a star randomly. Like, I just think it makes the story extra engaging in that way.
And I do think it's interesting, Christian, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I've read at least that our whole like cultural perception of Jiminy Cricket and his role within this story is entirely derived from this Disney film. Because I think Jiminy Cricket, I don't think he's even Jiminy Cricket in the book. He's just a talking cricket that Pinocchio meets and squishes after one scene.
Yeah, you're right. That was another Walt change. And from what I understand, I guess there were multiple installments in the Collodi novel or series of stories. And I guess Cricket dies and occasionally pops back up again, but he's never anything more than a smallest supporting character. Yeah. So interesting. I think a lot of the character work is done subtly, which is what makes it so great. Like we already mentioned Geppetto, but I think Lampwick is a great example too. The way Pinocchio meets him on the carriage ride, and Pinocchio's like can't get a word in edgewise with him because Lampwick is not interested in listening, just wants to talk and talk. Such a great way of depicting someone who's not very sympathetic or thoughtful, but is also not like beyond the pale evil in the way that, say, the Coachman is, but just a great piece of character work done in like 15 seconds. I also just love Honest John. I think he's my favorite Disney villain. Before, during, and after this viewing, I had "Hi Diddle Dee Dee" stuck in my head, and I still do, and I'm not mad about it.
I think Lampwick. This was probably a matter more of convenience than deliberation, but I think Lampwick and Pinocchio are voiced by the same actor, aren't they? I thought I read that. Which, if that is the case, and I'm not making that up, I think very conveniently appropriate. Christian, it looks like you're going to correct me. Are you going to correct me?
Yeah, sorry. I hate to, but
No. Yeah, go ahead.
The actor that plays Lampwick, Frankie Darro, was shortlisted for Pinocchio.
Oh, okay.
He was a child actor, but they kind of realized he had grown up too much and his voice had already gotten too deep.
Okay.
Dickie Jones, who plays Pinocchio, also plays Alexander, who is the donkey kid, who in one scene is like, I want to go home.
Well, that still works as a nice kind of comparison between the two. You kind of get this very deliberative subtextual idea that Alexander could be Pinocchio. That's the parallel.
Yeah.
It could happen.
Yeah, it definitely works. Were you guys offended by Stromboli?
I mean, I wasn't offended, but I did certainly think, ooh, this is a bit much. This might be a bit uncomfortable.
There's always got to be one character, at least somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Song of the South or anything like that, but it's
very low bar.
Yes, my dirt poor standards. But yeah, I do think it's a bit uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. It's like when I saw the lips, I already knew what was coming. We know that that's a dangerous indicator in early Disney animation.
Yeah,
and I will say that. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it was a pretty obvious archetype, and I guess it kind of serves the story a little bit. I mean, I'm kind of 50-50 on it. I personally was not offended because I am not Italian, but that would be weird to say for anything else. But I'll say for this case, I think having those like little Italian stutters and stuff adds some.
Before Mitchell digs his own grave, I don't think there's anything wrong with. Like, I don't object to that character being in the film. I don't even really think his appearance is that bad. I think it's fine for this big man with this big bushy beard to play this role and be this character within the story. But the performance does have, like, there's clearly bits of it where they're intentionally trying to make fun of stereotypes of a culture. And I think it's fine for him to. Well, now I'm digging my own grave. I think it's fine for, especially in like a simple story like this, considering its age. I don't think I would have been as uncomfortable if he just was that stereotype. But the fact that the movie seems to be trying to ridicule that stereotype is what pushes the buttons.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point. I'll jump in and try to save this a little bit. I think he functions similarly to Honest John, as depicting like levels of villainy. Like there's no suggestion at all that Stromboli or Honest John are good people, but at least situated next to the coachman, they seem relatively minor threats to Pinocchio and to goodness and society at large. And I think that's delivered well. I kind of forgot that this was a musical. I'm going to be honest. I guess I knew. I guess I was aware of When You Wish Upon a Star, and that song has kind of become like the Disney theme song that plays before any Disney animated film. But I don't know. It just this never struck me as a musical. So hearing all the music was interesting. A lot of it's just kind of more of a ditty than like a big 3-minute number that you see in newer films. But were you guys grabbed by it, or was it kind of a passing dated fancy?
It's kind of a musical in the same way that Duck Soup is a musical, where there are songs in it, but I don't think, other than When You Wish Upon a Star, which I think won the Academy Award, I don't think you're going to come away from this thinking, oh, that I gotta buy the soundtrack when I get home. Like, I don't think the thing that sticks with people about Pinocchio is the songs or the ditties. even though Hi Diddly Dee is catchy. I think it's the imagery and the characters and the settings more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of capitalizes on the childlike innocence of things that are clearly repulsive and sinful, and I think that using it as more of an ironic placement rather than an actual ironic placement of a ditty rather than an actual full-fledged song definitely lends more to the type of story that's trying to be told. And especially if you really like the song, it makes you feel even worse. You know, like, Pleasure Island, let's go, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think the irony is kind of what makes the songs, the placement and the irony of the songs themselves lend more to the story than actually being like epic songs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree. I think Hi Diddly Dee is a personal favorite, but admittedly, there's not much to it. Settings, we've kind of glossed over some of the settings: Pleasure Island, the town, Monstro, and the waters. I think I'll just add about Pleasure Island. That was initially just going to be kind of a theme park. Not too dissimilar from Disneyland and Disney World, which is interesting. I don't know how much Walt was thinking about the theme parks at this point in time, but it was Walt that basically insisted that kids eating too much ice cream and drinking too much soda was not a level of sinfulness that was requisite to the punishment of the situation, which in retrospect is kind of hilarious that some people some animators or some producers were like, yeah, if you drink too much soda and eat too much ice cream, you get to be a donkey slave.
That's also really interesting because in the 2022 remake, don't they replace the beer with they're just drinking too much root beer?
Oh my gosh!
And that's
I
an
haven't
officially
seen
sanctioned Disney remake where they they flip it flop, they flip it back.
Yeah.
I guess directly in contradiction to Walt's wishes. That's interesting.
Another thing of the time period, like having kids indulging in smoking and alcohol was a far more common occurrence at this time period, which kind of sucks because now we don't have anything as a reference point. Now it's like, Pinocchio's on TikTok again. Oh, how terrible!
Pinocchio's vaping.
Oh, he's vaping. Yeah, exactly. He's vaping, watching those TikToks. That would have been an effective story, Guillermo. Yeah, in his beanie.
Oh Lord.
Spreading political propaganda.
This suddenly became a very conservative podcast.
No thanks to me.
Oh my goodness. Well, I didn't have any other questions. I just have a boatload of more factoids from the book. I can share some of them.
Ready.
Zach already mentioned the thing about Mel Blanc, which is funny. I think it's especially funny that he recorded hiccups when he recorded all of his lines. And after they decided they were cutting his lines, they were like, we need you to re-record these hiccups for us. So he did those twice. They used the actors as performance references for the animators. So they had them on a soundstage acting things out. I think that probably comes through the most in the animation of the Blue Fairy, who seems like almost seamlessly like a person was dropped into the movie. But Mitchell, you might think this is funny. Christian Rube, the actor that plays Geppetto, I guess unfortunately sympathized with Nazism during the making of this film. And between takes, he would say a lot of great stuff about Hitler, like Hitler's this great guy. And I guess some of the directors were not too fond of him doing this.
No.
So in one of the takes where they were simulating the raft scene and some of the Monstro stuff, they shook him a little extra and doused him with a little extra water. And apparently after that take, he stopped talking about Nazism. So.
Well, it's the late 30s. We can excuse a little bit of it, okay? Time man of the year now. Come on. But that's interesting. I was kind of thinking about the contrast between Bambi, because World War II generally has a pretty massive impact on Bambi, including the fact that you will not find any males that could have been drafted actually voicing any characters in Bambi.
Interesting.
But this, I feel like a lot of what came out of this film came out of the the reproductions after that were sent to Europe, because I don't think anything besides munitions was getting over to Europe by the time this came out. So,
well, I did read that this wasn't that successful at first because of the Second World War, because that meant that the European and like Chinese markets were like cut off. Yeah, you're not going to make anything over there.
So there weren't any mainland Italians to be offended. So it's okay.
This wasn't distributed to Italy until I think maybe 10 years, but it was a long time. Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah. Pinocchio.
The use of real people as references in Disney movies. I know they did that for a long time. Like Fantasia, which came out later this same year, the famous Night on Bald Mountain sequence. There's like photos that they have of Bela Lugosi, who iconically played Dracula. They brought him into the studio to pose around with his shirt off, so they could use that as reference for the devil that comes out of the mountain.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. Wow.
And they also, not a person, but I love the look of the carriage in this of Stromboli's kind of carriage. And I know that was one of the things that I read. They found a lot of difficulty in animating from scratch. So they made a model. They made a miniature functioning model of the carriage that they animated frame by frame in stop motion, and then they printed that onto film and animated over it.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Which stuff like that takes me back to like season 1, where we were talking about all the trickery that went into like the Phantom carriage and doing. I mean, as simple as the effects in that are of just a ghost going through the frame, this is like 20 years later. They're doing the same thing to figure out similar effects for animation.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I still like SpongeBob better and regular show.
I kind of want to do the SpongeBob movie just to get Zach's goat someday.
And the regular show
SpongeBob movie. I did not like it.
Well, you're the only person on earth that thinks that, Zach, and that's not even controversial.
If SpongeBob has one hater, it is me. If SpongeBob has no haters, I am dead.
You heard it here, folks. You're eating your shoe again, Zach. You're eating your shoe again. We're going to talk about it.
I was going to say real ones know what that means, but I think no one but the three of us
No,
knows.
I don't think we ever publicized that.
Way too far back. What else do we have for trivia night? That was a lot of trivia. So let's say they remake Pinocchio, but actually do it the right way. And they do it with hand-drawn animation like back in the day.
Yeah.
Do we think that would be a good idea?
That's a very good question.
I would like to see a hand-drawn 2D animated loyal take on the original book. Because I do think, despite how maybe unlikable like directly adapted Pinocchio would be, I do think maybe the needle has swung too far the other way, where now the only Pinocchio that people know is this kind of gentle, wide-eyed Disney Pinocchio. And there have been attempts at adapting a more traditional Pinocchio. I know Roberto Benigni tried to do it in the 90s and was met with total derision. I would like to see maybe a major studio like Disney. I'm sure they wouldn't do it, but I would like to see a company with a major footprint and a major audience try something like that and see how viewers would accept it. Because a lot of the attempts to adapt it more traditionally have been usually from Italy. And so when by the time they get over here, they've had like a horrible dub, and people just immediately reject it as this strange foreign film. I mean, that happened with I think 2 years ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, with the version that Pauly Shore did the voice for, where
it got over happens here every time with Christian on this podcast, every single time.
That's true.
And Zach keeps trying and he keeps failing.
Yes,
that's what Suspiria was. Suspiria was my loyal Pinocchio adaptation.
I think that maybe there are just a few too many Pinocchio adaptations, especially right now. Though I'm sympathetic to what Zach says, and I mostly agree. Even films like, to me, the obvious touch point here is Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, which has a lot of very impressive stop motion animation, but I think maybe some of its weakness is, again, adhering too closely to Disney with a mostly ubiquitous Jiminy Cricket, a wide-eyed Pinocchio, maybe not as much as Disney, but still, and kind of forcing musical elements that weren't very good, in my opinion, when I saw it. So I don't know. I think maybe in a few years, but I think this Pinocchio that we're talking about today is kind of vastly underrated in retrospect. Like, its average rating on Letterboxd is 3.5, which
That's lame.
is by no means terrible, but certainly seems much lower than it should be. I don't know. Maybe in a few more years, I think, but I guess I'm not optimistic to modern audiences receiving a more faithful adaptation.
All right.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Those are, you guessed it, the 7 days of the week. That was our week in review.
And now for something completely different.
Well, I guess I'll
Go,
jump
Zach.
in because nobody's saying anything. And I'm going to talk about music in this week in review, but I'm
Okay.
going to talk less about the album and more about the background to an album. My current
The album
artist who
cover.
I'm listening to, their total discography is Edgar Winter, who's maybe not super well known. He's kind of a musician's musician, but he's a real keyboard prodigy. His brother Johnny Winter is a blues guitar legend, and I say that because literally every resource I have ever consulted on Johnny Winter opens with blues guitar legend Johnny Winter, comma. And he's released a lot of great albums and has some very iconic songs. Frankenstein, Free Ride is probably one that everybody knows. But in the 80s, he was Scientologist. And in 1985 or 86 or maybe 89, nobody seems to remember or know, and online articles can't decide, he released an album in collaboration with L. Ron Hubbard, founder and prophet of the Scientologist Church, which was an adaptation of his book series Mission Earth. So it's like a concept rock
What?
album where every song is based on like a character or a setting or an event from the book. It's incredibly bizarre. The only reason I know who Edgar Winter is in the first place is there's a YouTube music critic, Todd in the Shadows, who covered the album a few years ago. And I was so baffled by its existence, I decided I had to check it out. And I've checked it out, and it is very strange, but you know, Edgar Winter is such a good musician that he kind of pulls it off. It's weird to listen to because it's not like you can divorce Mission Earth, the book series, which this is adapting from Scientology, because the series is essentially Scientologist propaganda. It's like one of the last things that L. Ron Hubbard ever wrote. The entire kind of point of the whole series is there's this major thing about psychologists and psychiatrists turning people into homosexuals and rapists. And if you know anything about Scientology, they're very anti like mental health and psychology and psychiatry. So that's kind of an icky element of it. But when I'm listening to a track like Bang Bang, which is about a noir detective that the lead character meets in the 1940s in like the third book, and it's got this amazing saxophone solo, I find myself kind of having fun. The album is only a 2 out of 5. It's certainly not great, and a lot of it is kind of crappy 80s synth muzak, because synth just kind of went down that portal in the 80s, particularly the late 80s. But if you're interested in checking out something really weird, you could do worse. It's certainly not an unlistenable album. And in the catalog of Edgar Winter, I would call it his worst album I've listened to so far. But even then, I don't think I can say not to listen to it. So a very perplexing series of thoughts on Mission Earth from Edgar Winter and L. Ron Hubbard.
You've officially outdone yourself on the obscurity scale, which I did not think was possible.
Wait, is this the Free Ride song? Like, Which
So
song are
come
we talking
on
about?
and take a free ride.
Oh, okay. That song plays a lot in the Cars video game.
Oh, I didn't know that. I've never played the Cars video
Disney
game.
connection.
Yes.
Should I
All
go?
right, who's next?
I can go.
Go ahead.
Gosh, Disney is ubiquitous. I saw Inside Out 2 in theaters. I'm not sure when this episode is coming out. It'll probably be a few weeks removed from its premiere, but I rewatched Inside Out in preparation for this, which is a movie I loved when I saw in theaters and have very fond memories of seeing it with my mom. And on a rewatch, I didn't like it as much. I found joy kind of grating. I thought the humor got a little tiresome and was maybe dated to 2015. But, I still thought it was clever in the way it explored these emotional concepts. So I still give it a 3. But I was pessimistic for the sequel. I saw the trailer, thought it looked very bad. I heard that Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling weren't returning for their characters. And it's not being directed by Pete Docter either. So there's just a lot of things in play that made me pessimistic. When I saw it, I thought it was pretty good. I thought the anxiety character, which is introduced in the first teaser that gave me great pause, was actually very thoughtfully incorporated and played by Maya Hawke. Envy, another new emotion, is played by Ayo Edebiri, who you probably know from The Bear or Theater Camp or Bottoms, but she's certainly a rising star and almost universally liked, and I think that's deserved. A common complaint I see for this one is that it doesn't have this big, devastating emotional moment like in the first film, where, big spoiler warning, Riley's
Wait, I wanna hear this.
Riley's emotional imaginary friend, Bing Bong, perishes because she forgets him. I don't think that a Pixar movie needs to have tiniest violin playing sad moment. I think that's kind of a bad requirement to enforce on a movie. And even though this film also explores, I guess, the emotional development of a person and the importance of negative moments and emotions, I think it does so in a reasonably inventive and certainly an entertaining way. I think the comedy is really good here. I think it's probably in the same range as Incredibles 2, Monsters University, and Finding Dory as sequels, where some people are like, this is so much better, and some people are like, that was pretty good, and some people are like, this is kind of a dull sequel, it doesn't need to exist. This film is going to inspire all of those reactions. But for me, at least, I would put it in the top of that sort of tier of Pixar sequels. I think it's pretty strong and pretty funny and worth seeing. So not at all what I expected. I was very pessimistic going into this, but it was a 3.5 for me.
You're in the
I can
hot
tell
seat,
you,
Mitchell.
I can tell you it shouldn't have a sequel, but there's too much money invested. There's too much cloud technology. There's too many delivery drones. There's too much AI. There's too many free 2-day deliveries with Prime. I'm talking about The Boys, okay? So,
Uh-oh.
That was a good intro.
I have been, thank you. I have been unfortunately loyal. I've been very, very passively loyal. I've been like, you know what? This is pretty mind-numbing. This is pretty, I'm not learning anything. It's interesting. It's engaging. There's a lot of investment in the shock value. And sometimes you just I'll just watch it and see what happens kind of thing, right? So Stormfront in season 2 was kind of she was a pretty amazing actress, honestly. And it was a pretty engaging backstory that was very well weaved into the somewhat complicated politics. I'm talking very generously complicated politics of Vought, right? And season 3 focuses on Jonathan Eccles, I think is his name, right? Yes.
Oh,
I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
Okay, Soldier Boy. And okay, fine. Homelander have child. Okay, and then there's the other child, and that's the whole season. So this season is more about political polarization. It's about these two sides that are very clearly the American left and right, pretty staunchly, obviously. And there's also a whole subsection. There's like Firecracker, who's like, talking to like the QAnon people and the conspiracy theorists and everything, and that's a little subplot in between. And by the way, I'm only a few episodes in because only a few episodes have been released as of this recording. My general impression is that the acting has gotten better. The production is probably about the same. Anthony Starr is a fantastic actor, like 100%. He embodies the character. He is Homelander. He is typecast himself, and that's totally fine. It's just being milked. It's being milked. I hate to say it, but it is just taking advantage of whatever like national politics are going on, and then just kind of haphazardly inserting it into the whatever story that's going on in this. And it's kind of just, you can only be so ridiculous and so over the top for so long, which is kind of what my theory was going to be with this by the time the third season came around. And the third season had its moments. It had some character development with like Jack Quaid and everything. He's a great actor, totally convincing, easy to invest in. Erin Moriarty's a little bit weirder in this, and I think she kind of went through a life crisis or something, because she got significant facial surgery and kind of went crazy on social media about it. So that was weird. Fame getting into people's heads. It's just a very weird, like, there's so much investment. This is kind of like Amazon's big show now, so it's kind of just, once a show gets that much investment, it turns into like House of Cards or something, when all of a sudden the actors go crazy, or there's just like so much thrown into these same few ideas that it's just so obvious that it's going off the deep end. So that's what I think is going to happen. I do not think the season is going to surprise me anymore. I really don't think there's anything else to surprise me anymore. I think if you're at all invested in like the idea, or like have investment in certain characters or something, then maybe it's kind of fun to watch. I mean, Anthony Starr really does steal the freaking screen. I cannot emphasize that enough. But at the same time, it's like, how much can Homelander do? Like, I get it. Like, now they have another character they added to the Seven, who's like the smartest person on Earth, and that's like her whole thing. And she's like advising Homelander on things and being his new puppet. And he's like, instead of listening to Vought, a Homelander listens to the smartest person on Earth. And it's just like, this is kind of sensing, the smells a tad bit like we've just made this up as we were going along, and this was kind of just like a haphazard attempt to make something different out of something that's been the same. So it's a little bit more complicated than a show that's being run for too long, just because I do think there's serious acting potential, and there is some pretty neat ideas with the same characters, kind of how they're dealing with their powers and stuff. And but like the interest in Vought is like gone. Like, I don't care. I don't care if like the Starlight Homelander rivalry thing is so freaking dumb. I can't think of anything else way to say it, but yeah, it's just a ridiculous cash grab at this point. And there's going to be another season. So
yeah, maybe more. I did you hear about that, where it's no longer even locked at 5 seasons?
Oh okay.
Man. Yeah, like a year, because I was really into season 1 and 2 of The Boys. Like, we used to talk about it whenever it like would come back on.
And then I kept watching it, and then Zach was not.
But like, about a year or two ago, there was a big rage against this Netflix model of making like 2 seasons of a show or 3 seasons of a show, and then cutting it off regardless of where the show was, because the show has brought on the new subscribers that it's going to bring on. Give up on it. Who cares? We'll make something new to bring in new people, because we have those old people. And people rightfully didn't like that model. But I think something that people kind of forgot about about the non-limited series model is that often it comes with a "we're gonna ride this train as long as we can" mentality that just ends up with a show with no set plan or end in sight, running itself into the ground. And I do worry that's where The Boys is headed. I thought it could have ended with season 3. I thought maybe they'll cut it with season 4, and then they said we're doing a 5, and now they've said we're gonna ride this train as long as we can. And I'd like to get off. Thank you very much.
Season 2 is definitely like, we were planning on taking this idea from the comics and this is how we're going to implement it. We knew we were going to do this. Season 3 is like a experimental attempt at seeing if this will stick anymore, and for some reason it freaking stuck. Like, from an audience perspective, like, there's a huge amount of investment in the show audience wise, and their marketing is insanely good, and it's very easy to get a lot of really good investment when your marketing is very meta. So they have a lot of very meta, like, advertising. Kind of like, it instantly brings me back to freaking Blair Witch Project, where they were making everyone convinced that it was totally real, and these kids actually got freaking lost in the woods. It's just that kind of thing. That marketing mentality is the main reason, and also just so many people have freaking Amazon Prime. So
yeah, I can't help but wonder. I haven't seen a single episode, but I can't help but wonder if there's more pressure from Amazon after Rings of Power kind of fell on its face, that they need this like flagship show. I don't know. Very interesting. Well, I did hear about a Boys spinoff. It's called The Real Boy, The Boys Story. And it's starring Dickie Jones as a senile old man. He might be dead, I don't know. But Pinocchio's back.
I'm going to run to school now. Even though I don't know where it is and nobody told me.
Homelander's gonna wreck him if he doesn't run to school. Oh my goodness. Okay. Who's starting? I didn't pull it up. I was so wrapped up in my clever intro.
Which was maybe like a 4 at best.
Okay, Mitchell, you're starting. Are you ready?
all right, yes.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Let's go.
RKO.
4 out of 5.
Honest John.
4 out of 5.
Wishing upon a star.
3 out of 5.
Diagnosed with allergic.
2 out of 5.
Cricket POV.
3 out of 5.
Sleeping in the bread you've buttered.
3 out of 5.
Pet Riz.
2 out of 5.
Geppetto's Cuckoo Clock Menagerie.
3 out of 5.
Mel Blanc hiccups.
4 out of 5.
Being smart.
3 out of 5.
Being an actor.
3 out of 5.
A slight touch of monetary complications with bucolic semilunar contraptions of the flying trapezius.
4 out of 5.
Compound transmission of the pandemonium with percussion of spasmodic, frantic disintegration.
3 out of 5.
Palpitating syncopation of the killer diller with a wicky-wacky stamping of the Floydjoy.
3 out of 5.
Whistling to solve the world's problems.
2 out of 5.
Pleasure Island.
3 out of 5.
Cutting the strings for a man.
4 out of 5.
Actors with a conscience.
3 out of 5.
Child grooming and forced labor.
2 out of 5.
1 second, time. I guess I could have tried to
2
squeeze
out
it
of
in there.
5, huh? 2 out of 5.
We didn't really talk about the animals. I just want to say I think Figaro is very cute and very funny, and I love the gag of Geppetto saying good night and then asking him to open the window and chatting to him like
That was good.
like a fighting old couple. That was a funny bit.
The animals, I think, are particularly good since I read that Bambi was originally going to be Disney's second movie, and they delayed it because they weren't sure how to animate the animals in that. So I don't know if there was like an intentional focus on like the whale and Figaro and the fish in this to like, all right, this is practice for next year. We've got a whole forest to animate.
That's interesting. Bambi is S tier. We might need to talk about Bambi because Bambi's different. But what are we talking about next anyway?
Finally, a rest from all of this terrible, horrible world experiences, right? We have the fake Beatles and smoking and playing pool, and these are terrible things in the world. But no, do not fret, audience. Do not fret. Do not fret. Because the only thing that's slightly better than all these things is the Wannsee Conference deciding the final solution in the Holocaust. So we're going to talk about Conspiracy 2001. Stanley Tucci and Kenneth Branagh and every single epic British actor at the time, all speaking in English accents and not speaking German. And we're going to have a great time.
This episode's going to get age restricted, man. I just know.
I have to manually select if it's age restricted on Anchor, and I never do.
Ooh,
Hey,
okay.
there it is.
Because we're talking about a kids movie today.
Excellent.
So it's fine.
Well, I'm conspiring to watch that when it comes out. Oh, goodness.
Come on, Zach. Come on.
The show's over. Go home, everybody.